What is a Cagayano?
Yes.
Somebody born in Cagayan, somebody raised in Cagayan, somebody who has spent some time in Cagayan as a student, as a professional, or as a visitor. Somebody who's far from Cagayan, or at least one parent. Somebody who studies Cagayan in one way or the other. Somebody who speaks any of the Cagayan languages, Ibanag, Itawit, Malaweg, or Ilocano, and other indigenous languages there. By the way, we have something like 10 indigenous languages in Cagayan, if we include the languages of the Ita or Atta in the foothills of the Cordilleras and in the Sierra Madres. So any of these could consider themselves Cagayanos. But the one thing that cannot really be measured, that should tell you or anyone that you're a Cagayano, is that you carry with you the spirit of Cagayan, an affection for Cagayan, an admiration for Cagayan, an identification of Cagayan, and some awareness of Cagayan heritage that you carry along with you wherever you may be, anywhere in the world. So that would be pretty liberally what a Cagayano is, right?
Right.
Now, then your next question is, what does it mean to be a Cagayano? Well, again, it's not a simple question to answer. What it means to be a Cagayano is to value Cagayano heritage. And that includes history, language, culture, and arts. What it means to be a Cagayano is to be conscious or mindful of one's connection with this geopolitical region in the northeastern part of Luzon. A province whose coastline is 150 kilometers. I don't know if you're aware of that. Ilocos Norte in the north to the northeastern border of Isabela in the south. Thinking about just the coastline. Yeah. Somebody who has awareness of the fact that Cagayan is one of the most geographically diverse provinces in the Philippines. We have the Cordilleras in the west, the Sierra Madres in the south. And if you go way, way south, there's the Caraballo in one of the provinces of Region 2. And then you have an open area in the north, which is to say the Babuyan Channel. And many Cagayanos are not aware of this. The only archipelagic town north of Luzon is Calayan, the town of Calayan, which is one of the towns of Cagayan province. If you put it all of that together, and if you kind of connection with any of these, including some of the answers I tried to provide on what is a Cagayano, then that is what it means to be a Cagayano. But then again, that answer might not be here or there. It might be a little too general. So let's analyze it. Cut it down to pieces. Okay, let's look at our connection, each of us, our individual connections with Cagayan. Right, and let's start from the beginning. This may sound pedantic, but I think we have to do it to be clear about where we're going. First, the first time that a child is separated from his mother is when the umbilical cord is cut. All right? And that child still identified with his mother, even if he's now separate, physically separate. It's not until about, if you go by the French psychologist Piaget, it's not until he's about 3 or 4 that he begins to notice himself as separate from his mother. The child grows up, and the older he gets, the more separate he becomes from his mother. until he became a teenager, and now he's beginning to assert his own distinct personality, which might be a streak of rebelliousness sometimes, in order to define himself as an individual. Keep in mind that when we try to define ourselves, there are two considerations. One, who do we belong to? And two, how are we different from the rest who belong to the same set or the same class? Take me, for example, my name is Pedro Abraham. I belong to the family class or set Abraham, and among the Abrahams, I'm the Pedro. Together, that is your identity in very general terms. Okay? So let's move forward. In other words, your first society identifying yourself apart from your mother, your first society is your family. And then you extend that family to other members of an extended family. Beyond the family, you have your immediate neighborhood, your community. Not just your barangay yet, perhaps just a portion of your barangay. Then you move on to your identification in the barangay. And then you move into a larger geopolitical identification, larger than the barangay, which is the town. And then from the town, you identify yourself as a member of a province. Take note, from the individual now to a province. And we did not start identifying ourselves geopolitically until we identified our barangay, right? After identifying ourselves to the province, there's the region, the Cagayan Valley region. And then from there, we move on to identification with the national community. In each of these identifications, as far as other people are concerned, our identity may be clear or not, depending on the size of this identification. What does that mean? In the Philippines, our archipelago of more than 7,000 islands, there are more than 180 languages. By last count in Ethnologue, 186 languages. Yeah. Even the languages in Cagayan are among these 186 languages. Principally Ilocano, Ibanag, Itawit, and Malaweg, and the others I tried to mention earlier. Okay. Among the language groups in the Philippines, the ones who are most readily identified by all Filipinos are the ones who belong to the larger language groups. From north to south, Ilocano or Iloco, Pangasinan, Kapampangan, Tagalog, Bicolano, and then from east to west in the Visayas, Leiteño Samarnon, otherwise known as Waray, and then you have Cebuanon in the central Visayas, and then Hiligaynon, more familiarly known as Ilonggo in western Visayas, and then in Mindanao, you have many combinations of Ilonggos and Cebuanos and others, including our Muslim groups, the largest group, numerically speaking, of which are the Maranaos, and they number something like 2 million. These groups that I mentioned number 2 million more, and that's why they're very readily known by other members of the national community. But those who belong to the minority groups, whether they be among our indigenous communities or our lowland Christian groups, like Ibanags, Itawit, and Malaweg in our province, or the Zambals in Zambales, for example, the Kiniraya in Antique, the Masbateños in Masbate. These language groups are not too well known. Very often, our identity in the north is considered solid north or just northern or Ilocano. But we know that we are not Ilocanos, although there are many Ilocanos in our own home province. And the Ilocanos in our own home province should identify themselves as Ilocanos of Cagayan, not Ilocanos of Ilocandia, because that itself is part of the Cagayano identity. You see what I'm getting at? Yeah. Largely unknown to most Filipinos because we don't belong to the majority language groups. So what do you do if you're unknown? Then you make yourself be known by asserting yourself and calling attention to yourself, your province, and everything that is important to your heritage up here in Northeastern Luzon.
Sir,
Each of us, all Filipinos, have different layers of identity. And that's why I started from the beginning, from the individual, from the baby, cutting the umbilical cord. All of these are identities. We all have multiple identities, really. We may not think of it that way, but that is how we're going to be perceived. Uy, sino ka? Edru Abraham. Ah, ganun ba? Saan ka nag-aaral? O saan ka nagtuturo? Sa UP. O, identity mo na yan. Connection mo sa UP. Ah, ganun ba? May probinsya ka ba? Oh, sa Cagayan. There you go. Saan sa Cagayan? Tuguegarao. Oh, kung taga-Tuguegarao din, malunong ka mag-ibanag. O mag-itawid. Oh, right. So, in other words, each one of us, within ourselves, carry multiple identities. It all depends on the kind of audience we're talking to, or the need to assert that identity, the circumstances that needs to assert that identity. Now, in terms of the national community, how do you assert ourselves? I always assert myself, identify myself as an Ibanag.
same.
And, when I'm asked to be from Tuguegarao, try to connect the audience with something Ibanag, etc. And this I say all the time. You may not know this, but I happen to belong to the province where the first Filipino, what the anthropologists, archaeologists, and theologists call the Homo Luzonensis from 65,000 years ago, belongs. And he was discovered in Calao Caves in Peña Blanca. O hindi ba maganda yon? Cagayano, ang unang-unang Pilipino. Now, at least now there is now a connection.
Yes.
If you can just connect that, that's a very, very significant connection, that the first Filipino, as far as archaeology, anthropology, and paleontology is concerned, was a Cagayano. Right.
Right.
And then,
Thank you.
yeah, that's right. And then you begin, depends. There are many circumstances whether you're, for example, we're all agog over Boracay. Don't you know, that we have among the finest beaches, not just in the country, but in the world, according to CNN. That's in Palawi, one of the island barangays of Santa Ana in northeastern Cagayan. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
then, again, in other words, you begin to find a connection. Do you know that whenever you use your computer, without being mindful, you are using a technology that was founded by a Cagayano.
I was thinking about him this morning.
From the barrio of Malabak in the town of Igig, just north of Tuguegarao. Do you know who he is?
I was thinking about him this morning, and I was thinking, Cabs,
I'll give you his first name. His nickname is Dado
Banatao. Yeah.
So what do you say? Whenever you use your computer, the technology that links your computer with other computers was invented by a Cagayano. Things like that. Make Cagayan known somehow. You can always find a connection. You can always find a connection. But you cannot do that unless you know Cagayan. And yet you are mindful and you have a serious attempt to understand your own province. The details of your province, the things that are measurable and the things that are immeasurable. People, towns, geographical units, the River Cagayan, etc., that empties into the Cagayan River, the Pinakanawans. Pinakanawan is an old term for river. Therefore, if you say Pinakanawan River, you are redundant.
Sure.
You're saying river. And there is a Pinakanawan from Peña Blanca to Tuguegarao that joins the Cagayan River. There's also a Pinakanawan from the foothills of the Sierra Madres to Ilagan that also joins the Cagayan River. I'm just mentioning this because these are two towns. These are two different Pinakanawans, but they call it Pinakanawan there and they call it Pinakanawan here because it means in the old language.
May I
river.
ask language? What language is
Ibanag.
that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should say Itawit.
Itawit.
Because the original language of Southern Cagayan is Itawit. In fact, the majority of Southern Cagayan is Itawit speaking.
And Ibanag came from where?
Well, the really Ibanag speaking towns in Cagayan are Abulug, Pamplona, about half of Apari, Camalanyugan, and Lalo. These are the Ibanag speaking towns, the traditional Ibanag speaking towns. Yeah. And to the south, Amulong, Igig, Peñablanca, Tuguegarao, Solana, Enrilia, Piatuao, and portions of Rizal. These are the Itawat speaking towns. And therefore, in southern Cagayan, there are more Itawit speaking Itawit speakers, first language speakers than Ibanag, because in southern Cagayan, the only dominantly Ibanag speaking town, not even dominant, whose centro, whose population is Ibanag speaking, is Tuguegarao. If you notice, Ranso na Tuguegarao, Itawi Gama.
How did that happen?
Arguably, there are as many Itawit first language speakers in Tuguegarao as there are Ibanag.
How did that happen? How did Ibanag become the dominant language in the centro of Tuguegarao?
That is when the capital of Cagayan was moved from Nueva Segovia, which is Lalo. Think of this as one province, Cagayan Valley, Labi. Yeah, and then it moved to Chage, to Yogad country. And then when this was divided into 2 provinces, later on 3 provinces, the capital of Cagayan was moved to Tuguegarao. When that happened, many of the what you call the Indio Principal, the compradors or middle persons between the Spanish overlords and the masses, the Indios, came from the north, and they came down to settle in Tuguegarao. Aside from the fact that from the very beginning, the Spaniards, because it is a language of first encounter, chose Ibanag as the link language of about 6 or 7 languages in the valley, lowland languages: Ibanag, Itawit, Malaweg, Yogad, Gadang, and Isinahi. Yeah.
And all these languages that the Spaniards that were around during the arrival of the Spaniards, they all still exist. I mean, I know for a fact, of course,
Yes.
I am Ibanag. Ilocano, yes. How about
they all exist? What this means was the Spaniards, this is a region of so many languages. One of the languages which they chose as lingua franca or link language among language groups that otherwise cannot speak to each other was Ibanag. And therefore, official decretos, directos, doctrina cristiana, or anything coming from the central government in Manila, or coming from the diocese in Lalo, and later on in Tuguegarao, they had to be written, if not in Spanish, in Ibanag, so that it could communicate to all of these other language groups all the way to the Caraballo, to Santa Fe. All right? And so that's why Ibanag is very important. That's also the other reason why Ibanag is the prestige language, historical prestige language of Cagayan province. And that is the reason why Tuguegarao spoke Ibanag. You spoke the language that was most powerful and most prestigious, next only to Spanish in the old days.
I see. Thank you.
But
yes.
That doesn't mean to say that we have to abide by these old rules, but these old historical rules, you know? And that is why, and I think Kevin and Prince know this, I have been batting for the Tuguegarao Cultural Society should be called Tuguegarao Cultural Society and not Ibanag Cultural Society. Because to say Ibanag is to privilege Ibanag at the expense of Itawit. When Itawit town is, Tuguegarao is just as Itawit as it is Ibanag. Numerically speaking. Right? That's why I've also been batting for the Itawit to assert themselves, not to allow themselves to be looked upon as something peripheral to Ibanags. just because Ibanag has the historical advantage. Numerically, there are more Ilocano speakers now in Cagayan than any of indigenous. By the way, the Ilocanos have been here in significant numbers since the 1850s. That's about seven generations of 25 years each. The anthropologists count a generation as 25 to 30 years. That's 7 generations. But they are relatively latecomers, because indigenous to Cagayan are the Itawit and the Malaweg and the Ibanag, of course. But the Ibanags, as I said earlier, were populated the northern coast before they came down.
But as you brought up earlier, the identity of a Cagayano is in different layers. Nowadays, especially now, it's not defined by just one. And even the province itself, that's what makes it so interesting. And what would make a Cagayano so interesting is all these layers that make up our identity. That
is why the title here is self-awareness. You have to be aware of your own, what you might call micro-identity as it enlarges, so that you realize how rich you are. How rich you are. Look at our richness. I am Ibanag and I speak 7 languages, including 4 Philippine languages: Ilocano, Ibanag, Itawit, and of course Filipino. Oh, let alone a little Spanish and English, and I studied in Indonesia for a while and I speak that too. And then you're all the richer for it. And so I said, I make the Tagalogs, the people who grow up in Manila, defensive. Kayo mga taga rito, dadalawa lang alam yung wika eh. Filipino lang at saka Tagalog lang at saka English eh. Kami sa Cagayan. Aba, napakarami kaming wika. In other words, nakikita namin ang mundo sa pamamaraan ng wikang aming sinasalita. O di mas mayaman ka dahil sa dami ng wikang sinasalita mo. Kevin, for example, is Ilocano, but he identifies himself every bit as a Cagayano. It's nothing different. We were just talking about, as I said, our own familial roots. And in this case, it's Ilocano. In my case, it's Ibanag and Lebanese, as it happens.
Okay, you brought up Lebanese, and I would like to bring this up to talk about, self-determination. You are your identity is so strong, and your connection to your identity as Cagayano is so strong. You're so definite about being Cagayano, but you have this. I bring this up for the sake of the migrants to Cagayan who are looking, maybe, how do I connect to being Cagayano or to Cagayan? I just got here. My parents were not born here. I wasn't born here. Someone like you, your identity as Cagayan, you've made it so strong. You've claimed it. You made it you, right? But your father is from Lebanon. So you're what? You would be considered second generation Cagayan.
That's what you might call that my physiological or genetic identity, But where is your heart? I grew up in Tuguegarao. I was raised in Tuguegarao. My playmates are Tuguegarao. My relatives are in Tuguegarao. Except for appearance, everything about me is nurtured from my Tuguegarao roots, my Cagayan roots. So, but I'm unique. I'm not like most Filipinos. I'm a little different. But what should not be different is that because of my own self-awareness, you cannot be proud of something you're not aware of, that you dismiss as something in the periphery of Ilocanos in the north, or something in the periphery of the Tagalogs who are dominant, who are now linguistically dominant because of the influence of Filipino and media using Filipino. That is, how can you be proud of something you don't know? It's elementary. So you have to know.
So
the only way to know is to learn, to study, and to be open-minded about it. And that is why I started with layers of identity. You don't have to define yourself as a Cagayano from the people of Bagay or Larion or Barangay number 5 in Tuguegarao. They know and you know. But for outsiders, you may have to define yourself. To outsiders coming in, you'll have to define yourself. And going out of the environs of Cagayan, you you may have to define yourself. Uy, taga Norte ka pala, Cagayan. Di Ilocano ka? Hindi. Marunong ako magsalita ng Ilocano. Pero ako ibanag. O bakit iba? Bakit medyo iba yata ang mukha mo? Dahil kalahati ako Lebanese. So you could go become more detailed, But the main point is, love yourself first. That's what it means. You cannot know yourself if you don't love yourself. And part of loving yourself is knowing your roots and your heritage.
So your
if you are confused about that, and try to unconfuse it, organize it. And the only way to do it is study, to become self-aware. And ask yourself, what are the good things about my own heritage? And you go on and on and on. It's a never-ending study. It's a never-ending study.
We were fantastic. It's really, that's one great thing that you just said. It's never-ending study. Life is like this, that it's education, it's continuous education. It doesn't end with your college diploma, or even in your case, your master's degree. It goes on and on.
That's it. Keep an open mind. And the interesting thing too is, the more you know about your own roots, the more you can connect with other roots elsewhere. Not only in the valley, or even in Batanes to the north, part of our region too, but elsewhere. For example, just to give you one example, the valley was Dominican mission territory, right, Prince and Kevin? This was the Dominican mission territory. So, if this was Dominican mission territory, what was who were the regulars who had, for example, Ilocandia as a mission? The Augustinians, right? How did it happen that the Dominicans were assigned here? Well, for one thing, the Dominicans were latecomers as an order coming to the Philippines, and then they were assigned the huge west coastal Luzon province of Pangasinan. And from Pangasinan, the only way you could go to Cagayan was by the northwestern coast of Luzon, due north, and then due east, the Bubuyan Channel, and then down through the Cagayan River. Wow, that was the most convenient. But later on, they found the Villafuerte Trail from Pangasinan across the Caraballo to the Cagayan River, whose mouth is in Nueva Vizcaya, all the way downstream. Is it downstream or upstream to Apari?
Downstream.
Downstream.
Downstream to Apari. Okay? O di may connect ka na sa Pangasinan. Quite. I claimed it. I claimed the identity. And then I insisted on claiming it, and I asserted it. To know is to claim, and then you assert it, Okay, it's like this. No, as a child, I would like to watch movies, and like every child in our day, and even now, I liked, American Western movies, and I knew about the Apaches, the Sioux, the Arapaho, the Iroquois. I knew all these things. And then one time, we had a store in the public market, and right in front of our store was a kalinga who was dressed in baag, who was seated squatting right in front of our store. And I befriended him, kalinga. As it happens, he could speak Ilocano, and by that time I could speak. I was about maybe 9 or 10. I could speak a little bit of Ilocano. And then it occurred to me, these are a minority group I know very little about. How come I know more about the American Indians than these people? Then, and in subsequent weekends, there were atta coming from Peña Blanca, coming down selling Bavinat Talon and utta in the public market. Atta, in other words, atta in the east, in the eastern mountain, and kalinga in the western mountain. In the western mountain. Sabi, there's something not quite right here. How can I not know about my neighbors while I know more about America, just because American information to the movies and everything else, radio and all of this opportunity sense of economic and informational power were reaching me. And then I asked myself, how do I get to know? So I began asking people. As it turns out, not too many people knew anything. It's all anecdotal. And then I said, I should know. I should know about these things. And then if I have to know them, I should know about Ibanags also. Because I realized, even as a young boy, that very few people outside of our own region knew about Ibanags. So you claim, and then it's not enough to claim, you assert. What does it mean to assert? You're going to say, look, I'm an Ibanag. I come from the Ibanag peoples of Cagayan, and we too have made a contribution in the history of this nation. O ganun ba? And then they ask you, ano yun? Then you must know. Hindi lang nyo alam eh. Then you make the defensive. Kayong mga Ilocano, Juan Luna at Antonio Luna. O kayong mga taga Iloilo, Lopez Haena. O kayong mga kayong mga Tagalog, andyan si Rizal at saka si Del Pilar, etc. Yeah. Alam namin kayo pero hindi nyo alam kami. Sasabihin nila, ba't naman namin kailangan malaman kayo? Hindi ba mahalaga na malalaman mo rin kung sino ang ibang Pilipino na katulad mo? Kailan ba Pilipino? Put them on defensive. Dahil hindi nyo alam, sasabihin ko sa'yo. Totoo naman eh. Hindi ka naman nambabola. Nagsasabi ka na. So you realize that very little is known about us here in the North. So you assert yourself, find every opportunity to talk about yourself, to link yourself. Every opportunity to get, there are always opportunities. Use your creative imagination to link. For example, this De Venecia, this Congressman De Venecia, then use the linkage. Do you know that we were, that there is a lot that is Cagayan, that is Cagayano, in the sense of the Dominican connection. Oh, here's another Dominican Pangasinan connection. What we call a huge knife, a huge sword, a working sword, or sometimes a martial sword here in Cagayan, among other terms, is kalasyaw. Do you know that blacksmithing was introduced from Kalasyaw town in Pangasinan to Tuguegarao? And that is why it's called kalasyaw. When I was growing up, there was a breed of cockfight called Bulinaw. It came from Bulinaw, Pangasinan. Oh, by the way, Bulinaw is another town that speaks a different language from Pangasinan. Not a dialect of Pangasinan, but we don't know about it. Just like the Zambals or Zambales. We don't know about it. If they don't assert it, we don't know about it. Unless we go out of our way to learn, or unless they assert themselves, we won't know. And that is true of most of the minority language speakers in the Philippines. I think the first thing I'd like to know, I would assert is, speak the language. And that is why, among anthropologists, peoples are identified for their ethno-linguistic group. Ethno, from the Greek word ethnos, which means society. Linguistic. So my identity is Ibanag. One of, as I was saying earlier, 186 languages in the Philippines. Just one. Or two, if you include Itawit. Yeah. So you start with that. There has to be an appreciation of language, because there is no better accumulator of values than language. There's no better way of embracing your own heritage than through language. And all the others may branch from there. Then after that, get interested in everything that's Cagayano. Culinary arts, the songs, places, Tuguegarao. Tuguegarao is interesting. Let me just give you, people will ask, bakit Tuguegarao ang pangalan ng Tuguegarao? Well, there is no one single answer to that. More research will have to be done. But there are old mid-18th century records that called this town Tubigaraw. Tubigaraw. I think the historians among us, Kevin and Prince, know that Tubigaraw. But there are also other theories that may be anecdotal, but using a little creativity, maybe just as legitimate and academically defensible. That is what you do when you try to write the history of people who don't write history. You have to be creative. You know what Henry Scott calls take notes from the cracks in the parchment. All right. So what? One theory is to be in an occasion of fire. They ask, why is this? Why is this blackened area of the town? Nakuha tuggi nga nagragaraw. Tuggi garaw. But I heard a story from Ama Ingo Malyo, one of our historians of a previous generation or 2 generations ago, with whom I had a good relationship with because I was interested in history even then. And he said, Tugeg raw might be from matugeg katao. Matugeg is to bank the boat on the river, on the side of the river. What do you call it? What is the word? If this is the boat and you try to land it on the shoreline, that is matugeg. Initawit. Matugeg katao. Oh, that's a theory. So there are 3 theories. So what is the correct one? We'll accept the 3 for the time being. What's wrong with Feve? Why do we have to limit to one alone?
Right.
Keep it as it is. Why do we have to quarrel about it? Let's wait until there's enough information, enough research, and then later on, maybe another generation or 2 from now, then we can settle with the correct one.
Well, there might not even be just one correct one. I mean, myths have their value as, being representative of the mindset or of the beliefs of the people at a certain place, at a certain...
And then, well, I always say, I am very lucky. My town has 3 origins. Your towns have only 1. Like the town of Enrile was named after Gobernador General Enrile. What was the old name of Enrile? I forgot the old name of Enrile.
Kabug. And some other.
But that's definite. Enrile. Or, any of these other towns with the Hispanic names, Peña Blanca, for example. That's definite. Okay? At least in our case, we have 3. For the time being, let's be happy with 3. Things like that. These are all anecdotes, of course, but the possibilities are endless. What you eat, the games that you play, the terms that you use for things in the house, descriptions of feelings, descriptions of things. They are endless. And you just keep on going. Just keep an open-minded and a healthy interest of things. And then later on, you can try to connect it. I'll give you another example of an Ilocano connection. Most Ibanags don't think about it. We don't, we call one of our favorite dishes now, pinapaitan. Ilocano ang root niyan, but we don't call it kapepetan because pinapaitan is kape. Right away, it's a culinary borrowing from Ilocos because we call it pinapaitan. Di ba? No Ibanag calls it na pepetan. That would be the translation. Kapepetan. Nakatam na pe in Ibanag is what's it? Bitter?
Bitter.
Is bitter. Nobody calls it. However, the Ilocanes have a dinardaraan. But we have our own zinagan. Now, itawit also. These two words are different words and are indigenous to Ibanag and indigenous to Ilocano. It's no longer a borrowing. And that tells you that we have had this dish a long, long time, perhaps as early as the Ilocanos. And the Tagalogs call it dinuguan. It's the same root. Dugo, dara, daga, zinagan. Same root. By knowing that alone, you can already carry a conversation. Then that conversation can carry you into culinary arts. Then culinary arts. There are a lot of foods in Tuyegrao that are that we call that are from the Spanish, and right away you know the connection. But it's not so much that it's originated from Spain. What are the variations? How did we claim it as our own in Tuyegrao? And what changes did you make to do it? Just like La Jota Cagayana, the dance. The Jota comes from Spain, right? But it's a Jota that is Cagayana, and it's different a little bit, although similar to the Jota of Lawag, Mongcadeña, Tarlac, Batangueña, Zambales, and Iloilo. They all have Jotas, but our Jota is a Cagayan Jota. Meaning to say, they all come from the Hispanic song dance form. But there are uniqueness about our Jota in some of the movements. But the music itself of all these Jotas are similar. They are rooted in the Spanish Jota.
But
Also,
we adapted it to make it our own.
And you always do that anyway. You borrow and you turn it into your own. Just like Minudencia or adobo. Our adobo in Tuguegrao is a little different from the adobo elsewhere. This is the Ibanag Itawid variation of adobo. Or sinagan. Isinagat tampu na murumuri ta karne. Isinagan na Tagalog walabad di. Araru extender da. Na conforme nga vegetable. Nitam karne nga po na panap karne. Kaya na talaga nya. Napakanin ni Ricardo to. Walabad din ba karne na? Mareklamo ka ano walabad di karne na zinagan na Tuguegrao. All right? Variations. But that's make it interesting. We are so alike, yet different. What we are, that we should value.
Mm-hmm.
We should value what we are. The reason why I started with identity, the very basics of identity, is to show that identity means the class you belong to, and within that class, how different you are. So we in Cagayan belong to the class or the set of Filipinos.
Mm-hmm.
How alike are we with other Filipinos? For one thing, we all speak Austronesian languages. Although we in the valley speak the Cagayan Valley branch of the Philippine Austronesian languages. Get it? Oh, sorry, ito na. You are classifying again.
Mm-hmm.
All right? But right away, you define how you are alike, but how you are unlike also. Isn't that interesting? That's a richness.
Yes.
All right? However, and I cannot underestimate this either. There is a time when you need a vehicle for unification or tightening of that vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
English, because it's a colonial language, although widespread, cannot do it, or if it can only do it in a very shallow, even if official way. You have to have a link that is indigenous. And because Tagalog is the historical, religious, governmental, economic center of the Philippines for 400 years and more, that became what you might call the link, the lingua franca for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why what we call Filipino has Tagalog as a moderating language. I always say, my friends, if Apari were discovered as a good harbor by the Spaniards and they moved the capital from Manila, which is an excellent harbor, to Cagayan, and from Cagayan, they started northward to try and colonize Taiwan and maybe parts of China, then who knows, Ibanag might be the lingua franca of the Philippines. Do you follow what I'm saying? If Tuguegrao became the, it harbor became the center of American Spanish colonization, then all of these others would have been subordinated in a way to Ibanag, and Ibanag might be the national language. But take note, the Spaniards first landed in Cebu, okay? and Cebu and Mactan are good harbors, but these are inland harbors, in-island harbors. They had to look for a harbor that spreads out to the sea for easier transmission or communication to the outer sea. And in Manila, you have an excellent harbor in Manila. There's Cavite. There is even a harbor in Corregidor and in Bataan. Excellent. That's why the Spaniards moved. So geography is destiny. Geography is destiny. But unless you know these details, you won't be able to defend your own role in the shaping of the national community and your contributions to it. In other words, you have to know yourself. And the best way to know yourself is to speak your own indigenous language. And then you can branch from there. Every other element of culture, bar none, should be interesting to you.
How do we do that now, Uncle Edru? Cagayano, as you know, is now the regional center, so it's a melting pot of so many cultures and so many migrants who are thriving there. And even some of the children of my own friends who were born and raised there, they have the accent, but they don't speak the languages anymore.
Well,
Ani makuatam about that?
Well, liwa na magana ito. In other words, the ibanagnas of the parents were not strong enough to teach the language to their children. They were happy enough to subsume their own language to the language of the general majority, which is Filipino, or to the national language, or to one of the national languages. Oh, the national language and one of the official languages.
But that happens.
That indicates to you how weak the sense of Ibanag is of the parents, especially if two of these parents are Ibanag themselves, or Itawit, or Malaweg, or Ilocano, as the case may be. I understand this is a problem not just in Tuguegarao, but in many parts of the country, because of the strong influence of Filipino through media. You know, I was listening to some friends in Lawag complaining about the same thing. The young people prefer to talk to each other in Filipino. Yeah. So you bring it back to them. And ikaw makuatam, well, you tell the parents to teach it and make sure that the school system is aware of Ibanag as a first language, or Itawit as the first language, as the case may be, or Ilocano, depending on the part of Cagayan you're in. It has to be taught as a mother language. Tapi arikat taman na adbing. Pero mamegafutang maganaya to. If to the parents it's not important because they can carry on anyway, then you lose it. You might identify yourself as Ibanag in other words, but if you don't understand yourself as an Ibanag by language, then it's a weak identification. It's just like there are Filipinos who don't speak Filipino. If you don't speak Filipino and you're a Filipino, and then your Filipino-ness is weak, no matter how you assert yourself in English as a Filipino, or it is weakened. Let me just say it weakens your identity.
That makes sense, because when you speak the language, you are actually verbalizing the mindset of that culture, right?
Yeah, a language is a world unto itself.
Mm.
And that is why, speaking in another language is getting into another world. Yeah. And it's a wonderful thing to feel that way. It's not just part of, let me give you an example. Part of that is part of language is gestures. In fact, gesture language probably came even before spoken language. Okay. Yeah. Oh, if I do this, what do you understand it to mean? Kevin and Prince, what do you understand it to mean? Tililik, di ba? May katok.
Krung.
Diferensya utak. All right? In Argentina, it means phone. Call me by phone. Because of the old phone that you had to ring like that. You understand? The old phone. I mean, the phone at the turn of the last century. The beginnings of the phone.
The rotary dial phone.
That's right. Yeah. Phone. Ganun. So, and yet these are gestures. So, in Europe, for example, if you call, you use a gesture like this. But we in Asia, in Southeast Asia, call like this. We understand what it means, but it's a different gesture. Isn't that interesting?
How about the counting, like 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3?
That's right. There are some who count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My teacher in elementary used to count 1, 2, 3. Apa na pa ganyan na 1 and then 1 and then tambitan na pa 2, so tambitan na pa 3, tambitan na pa 4, then 5. In other words, these are just variations. We happen to understand them, but how interesting. They're so simple, yet they're so varied. Human creativity. Or even in the sounds we use. Look at how rich Ibanag is. We have z, e, all of these that Ilocanos don't have. That's why it takes an educated Ilocano to say Filipinas, not Pilipinas. Or zebra, not zebra. It takes an educated Ilocano, at least a high school or a college Ilocano, to say that, because they don't have that, these phonemes in Ilocano. But you have it in Ibanag. That is why it is easy for Ibanags and Itawid and many of the speakers of the regional of the Cagayan of the valley languages to speak or to pronounce English. Yeah.
Because we have the V and the Z.
Yeah, that's right. So then you can use that as a talking point. You know? Bakit ang galing-galing ng mga Ibanag mag-English? And then explain mo. So advantage namin yan sa inyo. And then you say, do you know that in Metro Manila, only 5% of those who apply for call center jobs are admitted, mainly because of difficulty in speech, because call centers are speech-oriented, right? But among those coming from the valley, especially from Cagayan, up to 30% are considered good enough. Look at the difference. You know, melting pot na kanina, 5% lang. Sa atin, 30%. But we're talking about the capacity to speak or the ability to speak English. This is just one of those things. And then if you have to use it in a conversation, then say so. We have a certain advantage because in our language, we have phonemes that you don't have in your native, which you have to learn because it is introduced to you through Spanish or English. So unless you know that, you cannot defend Ibanag, or you cannot at least demonstrate that you have certain advantages. Not to put down any other Philippine group, but to show that you have certain advantages. What's wrong with that?
Right. That's correct. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a very, very interesting, and I said very easily because I'm Ibanag. Very, very interesting talk with you, Uncle Edru. Thank you so much. Before we go to the questions, there are a lot of questions for you, right, Kevin, in the chat box.
That's right.
Before we go there, can I ask you something? There's been an urban myth in Tuguegarao. Mama, truck tomba, Bavi Carela. True or false? Did that ever happen?
When I was growing up, I think a lot of people were envious of my father, who was not really learned, but he was Lebanese, and the Lebanese are a mercantile people from ancient days. And so he became a very successful businessman. And because he is different, he became a subject of ridicule. Okay? And one of the subjects of ridicule is to imitate how he spoke Ibanag. And he would say, because we had a trucking company and the trucks would load pigs, he would say, "Truck tomba, baboy marcha." And he spoke some Spanish because he had a hotel and he had to learn Spanish because the elite of Cagayan and the Valley who used to patronize his hotel spoke Spanish. So "Truck tomba, baboy marcha," which goes right along that. Yeah, I used to hate it when I was young. Pakisuntunga gari eh. I used to hate it, but I said, well, it is a subject of ignorance, you know. But the important thing is he became Don Pedro Abraham, and we are his children, proud children of Don Pedro and Doña Afing. Like I said, you cannot defend, you cannot claim what you don't know or what you are unsure of. Once you're sure of something, once you're planted on good soil, then at least you know what you know and you know what you don't know. And from the point of view of what you know, you can defend yourself or assert yourself. But here's the thing, no one will assert our Cagayano-ness but Cagayanos themselves. No one is expected to do that. Don't expect other language groups to do that. You have to do it yourself.
So
You have to do it yourself.
Don't be.
So if they ask you, what is your contribution to the national community in the areas of economics, in the areas of high tech, as I was telling you about Banatao, in the areas of culture, in the area of history? Let me just segue a little bit and talk a little bit about history. Okay, very important, because this is something very unique to what happened in the valley, especially in Cagayan, vis-a-vis the priests during the revolution against Spain. Okay, Artemio Tirona came here to establish the Brigada Tirona. One regimento from Cagayan, one regimento from Isabela. All right, he wanted, in fact, he did round up all the Spanish priests, and he wanted them killed. And he wanted all the Santos, the Caucasian-looking Santos, nose to be cut, just like they did in the areas in Manila and the nearby provinces. Take note, these are Dominicans. Huh? And you know what the citizenry did? They defended the priests against the desire of Tirona. Because the Dominicans here did not all own large tracts of land which was subject to abuse. Unlike the Dominicans and the other regular groups, regular orders, the Augustinians, the Recollects, the Franciscans, etc., close to Manila. Oh, that is something Filipinos should know. Because they know Padre Damaso, and Padre Damaso was a Dominican, by the way. But that's what our Dominicans did. So you tell them this is a little different from what they did in Cagayan. Having said that, you also have to say, it doesn't mean that we were silent on the matter of abuse to Cagayanos. If you look at the first 150 years of colonization, one of the most rebellious was Cagayan. There was hardly a decade where there was no rising somewhere. Magala Dinigig. And then Dayag in Pamplona, among the Malawegs. When the Spaniards were coming into Malaweg, there was a rising. The Malawegs didn't want the Spaniards to come until much later. So we did complain. We did act against injustice. And you know what the injustices were? Abuse of some kind of civil authority, you know, especially the palo y trabajo, the forced 45 to 60-day forced labor per year. That was the subject of abuse. Okay, and of course taxes. And look at what happened in Cagayan, in Cagayan, especially in Isabela, Northern Isabela. The tobacco monopoly was also a monopsony. Monopoly when you had to sell only to the Spaniards. monopoly when you had to buy the seedlings only from the control ka na. Na-control ka na, ani ko pa ka na. So while you're aware of this, you have to say that the Dominicans were, at least from about the second half of the 19th century until 1898, that there were a very compassionate and serving order, the Dominicans. And you can read that from the reports of Julian Malumbres, what was done, and you just have to read the reports of Prince. And that's true. But in other words, you're giving it a balance. You could say, well, there was a lot of rising in the first half of Spanish rule, but in the second half, there was none of that. But, and here's the thing, we also identified with the national rebellion. And that's why we connected ourselves with the Aguinaldo and Nepomuceno and Pagulayan and who else were representatives to the Malolos Congress. Do you remember their names, Prince?
Yes, Vicente Guzman, opo. Gracio Gonzaga.
Gonzaga, Nepomuceno.
Nepomuceno.
Yeah, we were represented.
Yes.
But you have to know. Because you don't know, you have, let's face it, an inferiority conflict vis-a-vis the bigger groups. Why should you not feel inferior when you don't know yourself? And you even know more about your betters than yourself. You know more about the Ilocanos and the Tagalogs than you know than yourself, at least in terms of our history.
Yeah.
So it is true. There's a lot of what is the word? What is the word? Lack of self-confidence.
Yeah.
Lack of self-confidence. Let's face it. There's a lack of self-confidence. On the other hand, once an Ibayag speaks English, he's very, very confident because he speaks Ibana, pronounces English very well, and he's very well, that's one aspect where his Ibanag comes across and he said, "Oy, ang galing-galing na magsalita ng English." That's one. But when it comes to the other historical matters, he begins, ako, kakun. He begins to feel kind of smallish and unsure of himself. The only way you can know yourself is to study yourself, to learn from yourself and from your heritage. There's no other way. And that's why it's good to start from I don't know. Because from I don't know, you can begin to know.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We begin with I don't know, and we had a wonderful afternoon with Professor Edru Abraham. And know yourself, find out about yourself, know who you are, have an appreciation for what you are.
And be mindful of your multiple identities as a Filipino.
The layers of your identity.
Yeah, layers of identity. By the way, let me continue on just to finish this line. It's very important. So we did not start thinking of ourselves as Filipinos. We only started thinking of ourselves as Filipinos in the latter part of the 19th century. Before that, our tribal or communitarian identity was our language. If you are Kapampangan, Kapampangan. If you are Tagalog, Tagalog. If you are Ibanag, Ibanag. And so it's a leap. It's a leap of imagination because now you're identifying yourself with a geopolitical unit larger than your province or your region. That includes 7,000 islands and the imagined community of 7,000 islands, most of whom you don't know, but most of whom you embrace in a kind of imaginative way. From Batanes to Tawi-Tawi, from Davao Oriental to Pangasinan. Right. Okay. That happened only at the turn of the last century. Okay, like maybe started about 1850s. When these kinds of things began to percolate in the minds of Filipinos. In other words, in terms of that consciousness, that's only 7 generations. And now I'm going to tell you this. Think ahead, maybe another 2 generations. And I tell you, your passport is no longer Filipino. Your passport is ASEAN. You get the drift? So now your identity has become enlarged to ASEAN, to include 10 nations of the ASEAN, maybe 11 including Timor of the ASEAN. And then beyond that, you say, I am a world citizen. Now do you see why it's important to understand your levels of identity? Because whenever you communicate, you use one level of identity or another. And unless you know those levels, you are bound to communicate with a certain degree of confusion. You know, you just have to be sure of this level of identity. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that to our awareness, that we have to be aware of the several layers of our
And all of these layers are legitimate. They are all legitimate. They're all you. They're all part of you.
That's very
They're all
important.
part of you. They're all you.
Yeah. Okay.
If your primary identity is Ibanag and your national identity is Filipino, and if your language in your primary identity, in your ethno-linguistic identity is Ibanag, and your language is Filipino for the national identity, then do these two things as two separate identities. They need not be in conflict. What you do, belong to a minority, is to make sure that you are not dominated by the national language. And the only way you can do that is to assert your own language and culture. Welcome this as a way of connecting with all Filipinos everywhere, but at the same time, not to let go and to strengthen, in fact, your regional or ethno-linguistic identity. If you think of it as a conflict, and we'll always get in conflict, we'll always be quarreling with each other, and we'll always be blaming the Tagalogs. Why blame them? Isn't it a good idea that now, when a Filipino goes abroad, what do they talk to? What language do they speak with each other? Likely, they speak with each other in Filipino. Because there's an awareness, there's a nice language that connects us. All right? And now, so we need that as a way of connecting us in terms of as Filipinos. I am not saying we should relegate English to the back burner. Of course, we need English. It is right that English is our official language. It is our language to the world. You know, and as it is, we're, I think, the third or the fourth largest English-speaking country in the world. Yeah, there are about 110 million Filipinos, and of that number, about 60 or 70 can speak some form of millions can speak English in some form, with some level of proficiency. That's quite a lot. That's more than New Zealand, Canada, Australia put together. Even England. Okay, so let's take that. So it's a kind of mindset. If you think of Filipino as a way of embracing all other Filipinos, then do that. But at the same time, do not fail. And this is your responsibility now, as a member of minority, to assert your own language. Don't start blaming Filipino all the time. Don't start blaming the school system. Now we have up to grade 4, our own mother language system. Welcome that as a development so that you don't forget. Okay? Take the responsibility of asserting yourself. Don't blame the Tagalogs or don't blame Filipino. I don't take that view. I don't become defensive at all. Teach Cagayan history and values as early as possible. Okay? Even as you start teaching national values, start with home. That's the reason for a mother language. You start with what you own first. And language is not just speech, it's values. And that includes everything. Kaugalian, pagkain, and everything else. You start, and that is the responsibility of the education department. Teach every opportunity, in every opportunity, bring this in. Every opportunity to remind students of their history, their local history, bring it in. Bring it in a subject of discussion in social studies. Bring it in history. Even when you talk English, when English is the language being learned, use English to describe, things that are experienced here in Cagayan. In other words, there has to part of the syllabus of all the grades is the history of the language and the people and the region to which you belong, and weave that into every level of instruction. Every level of instruction. It's the only way. You cannot take it as a separate subject alone. Weave it in not just in mother language, not just in Filipino, but even in the sciences. If you teach the sciences, instead of talking about apples, talk about atis and mangoes. Instead of talking about distance from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., talk about distance from Apari to Tuguegarao, from Tuguegarao to Santa Fe, and from Santa Fe to things like that. Localize. Localize it is closer to home, and it's easier to learn because it's closer to home. Yeah. So it's a great responsibility. I know that in terms of the teaching from kindergarten to grade 4, there's a lot that has to be done, preparing the lesson plan and, the support materials, the study materials, complementary materials like posters and all kinds of things. I know it takes a lot, but it just has to be done if you want to value your first languages. It just has to be done. Otherwise, you will be dominated by both English and Filipino, and then you will complain again that you are being dominated. You become defensive again.
Localize. That's very important. Culture,
Indigenize, localize, nativize, and claim. These are keywords.
Indigenize, localize,
nativize,
Are
claim.
you guys? Claim. Take responsibility.
If you like, if you want to go deep enough, deeper still, indigenize. Leadership is important in two ways. To be a leader, you must be able to look ahead. You cannot be a leader without a vision. You know where you want to go. And the second is that you have to be able to lead, to hold the group so that you together know where to go and are happy doing it. In other words, leadership implies strong interpersonal skills, strong people skills, and of course, example. And then you go titillate it. And look at the leadership of, they're all here, Prince and Kevin. They started with the Cagayan Heritage Conservation Society, and now there's now several hundred members, and there's now a lot of writing. Every movement anywhere starts with a few people, a committee around the table. Then it gets enlarged. Look how large it is now, to the extent that it has influenced the provincial government, in that Kevin is now in a responsible position as a director of the Cagayan Museum. Oh, it just started with a few people. I didn't even know them. We had parallel interests. They were doing their thing, and I was also doing my thing. I got to know them only over the last 2 or 3 years. So we were sort of like breathing from the same air, so to speak. And then we met each other and became better. It became richer, like now. We are a young country, we are a young nation, and it's inevitable you keep on asking yourself, who am I, where did I come from? These are essential questions. These are just beginning questions. Who am I and where did I come from? In other words, you look at what came before. In my classes, you know, I start with the people's names. What is your name? Pedro. Your surname? Abraham. Your maternal name? Reyes. What does Pedro mean? I ask them. Many of them don't know what their names mean. So I challenge them, do you mean to say your parents just chose a group of syllables to attach to your persona without any meaning? In other words, your name is meaningless? Eh, bobo pala mga magulang mo eh. Walang meaning ang binigay sa'yo. Of course, that's not right. There's always a meaning. You know, maybe named after an uncle, an auntie, or something, a grandmother, etc. But I do that to challenge. Okay, in my own case, Pedro means stone, rock. From piedras, butros in Aramaic. Reyes means kings. From the Latin rey, king. But from the Spanish, Reyes. Abraham means from the Mesopotamian to the Hebrew, father of many nations. And because I'm my father's son, Junior. So you see, my name alone is myself, therefore, is a repository of history that I can be conscious of. Let alone biology, genetics, evolution, all of that is history of some way. You cannot run away from it. Even if you deny it, you cannot run away from it. You might as well deal with it and enjoy it.
And use it to your advantage.
Yeah. Look at your name. Mylene, which is the wrong pronunciation if you want to be French about it. The pronunciation of your name from the French is Mylène. Mylène, but everybody calls it, what? That has been indigenized to iba na Mylene na nga.
One. Guru.
Okay. So, obispo. That's easy. That's bishop in Spanish. Which means, anciently, you may have had a bishop for a relative.
Oh my God, he got lonely?
Maybe even a real bishop. All right? And then, quinto. That's another Spanish source, which means fifth.
Yeah.
All right? Now, Lising, I don't know if Lising is Chinese.
It's Kapampangan, so probably Chinese.
Probably Chinese, but I'm sure it means something if you dig enough. It's all the same for everyone. Prince, Wilson. Wilson means the son of Willie, the son of William. That's what it means, Wilson. Makarubo. Makarubo, Kari. Makarubo is makaribo. Darkness. It's a dark because forested area siguro. So it's darkish because it's forested. Ano pag apelido na nga Makarubo? Ano apelido ni Prince Wilson nga?
Anyari A.
Agbayani. Agbayani yung maternal name.
Agbayani.
Mother ko po.
Oh, the Agbayani is an adverb which is Ilocano.
Well.
Just like Agbayani, Agatep. Agbayani probably means, I don't know. Agbayani probably means illustrious or heroic or whatever. I don't know. You research. Why should I research it? That's your name, Prince.
Yes. Nagre-research din po.
Yeah.
Research.
Kevin, is Kevin Welsh or Irish?
I believe it's Irish po.
Oh, see, you're speaking because you don't know, you're not sure. Yeah. No, what I'm saying is, whether you like it or not, sa pangalan mo pa lang, repository of history ka na lang. Bigyan mo na lang ng halaga. Masama ba yun? Malalaman mo kung saan ka nang galing. That's how you start. And then you can branch off to larger things. Start from the personal. Just like in terms of identity, I started with the personal, with the individual. Then you enlarge that and start. That's how you do it.
So know yourself.
In other words, to go back to your original concern, all agencies of society, the private sector, business, LGUs, schools, should make a concerted effort to be mindful of this. I think mindful It's like a Gaura Cagayan, everybody thinks about it, but it has to be a intuitive, reflexive already. Hindi lang you think about it only on the 28th of June. Or you think of ayaw ng kalayaan only on the 12th or the 12th of June. It shouldn't be like that. It should be part of your reflexive part of your consciousness. Medyo malayo pa tayo doon. But it's a beginning. And we should carry on. Whether elementary or high school, there has to be a stronger emphasis on history and values, internal values. In Japan, up to the grade of grade 4, they don't give you information. The lessons they teach you is how to be a good human being and how to be a good Japanese. That's the focus up till grade 4. That's about 8 or 9. Before you start getting all of this information and organizing them in mathematics and all of these other subjects. That happens to be true.
And yet,
you have to have a stronger, and you have to have, but that will take a while, and that will take a systemic change. What you can do as a teacher is to put in as much of these values, culture, history, as you can within your lessons, in your lessons. Tie it in. You have to be imaginative. Tie it in. Question is, what can I do to enhance learning? And what can I do to make my kids better Ibanags, better Cagayanos? Yun eh. That's what you can do now. It's individual because the others are systemic. I think you know the answer to that. More subjects, more hours spent to history, not only history, but arts, for example, Cagayan dance, Cagayan songs, and Cagayan culinary arts, visual arts, etc. All of that. And exposure to Cagayan visual arts, including exposure to ecclesiastical arts, which is what Prince Wilson does, bring them to the church, find out where they was discovered, how long it took to construct them, who were the first teachers, it's things like that. Connect them. And even the layout of the towns. Why is the church here? Why is the Alcaldía here? What is the plaza in front of the church? Why is the convento on this side? All of that. You can always tie it in. You can always connect it one way or the other. Yeah. But you cannot connect what you don't know. In other words, you have to be a repository of richness, not just of history, but all kinds of things. And if you are smart, you will find a way of connecting them so that it comes across as something of value to your kids, to your students. About being a Cagayano as an adventure in itself. Because it is. It is an adventure through history, heritage, language, culture, and arts. Think of it as an adventure. Don't think of it as drab history that you learn in the textbooks. Although, of course, the information textbooks are, if they are correct information, are valuable. So think of it as an adventure of knowing yourself. But you can only know yourself in the context of your heritage, of your locale, of your space, time. Your space is Cagayan. Your time is now, but this time is connected to 300, 400, 4,000, 65,000 years ago. Because you are related to Homo luzonensis. So I think of it that way. I think of it as an adventure, as a story that has many, many chapters. And each chapter has its own excitement, has its own joys and tragedies, has its own sadness and pleasures, etc., etc.